When the Man of Steel meets a warrior forged in hell's own fire, even invulnerability starts to crack. The sky splits open. The ground screams, and something older than hope crawls through. Superman doesn't fear power, but this isn't power, it's judgment. So what happens when the hero who saves everyone faces the one thing he can't save? Himself. The sky above Metropolis split open at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that had begun with sunlight and the promise of normalcy. Ron Tarlow had been standing on the rooftop of the Daily Planet building, camera in hand, documenting the urban sprawl for a piece on reconstruction efforts in the industrial district. He had covered wars in 3 countries, witnessed the collapse of governments, and photographed atrocities that would haunt him until his final breath. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moment when reality itself seemed to peel back like burnt skin, revealing a wound in the fabric of existence that pulsed with sickly green luminescence. The rupture hung suspended above the skyline, a ragged tear perhaps 200 feet across, its edges crackling with energy that hurt to perceive directly. Through his telephoto lens, Tarlow captured the way the air around the anomaly seemed to congeal, to thicken into visible currents that spiraled inward like water circling a drain. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in as many seconds. His breath misted. Emergency sirens began their familiar wail across the city below, a sound that always preceded either Superman's arrival or something that required Superman's intervention. This time, it would be both. Tarlow adjusted his focus, his finger hovering over the shutter button, waiting for the hero's red cape to slash across his viewfinder. Instead, something else emerged from the rupture. A figure, man-shaped but not human in the way it moved, in the absolute economy of motion that suggested a purpose refined to its purest, most lethal essence. The armor was green and bronze, scorched and pitted by conflicts that predated nations, and even through his lens, Tarlow could see the way light seemed to bend around it, as if reality itself recoiled from the weight of whatever history that armor carried. The figure did not fall. It descended, dropping the 100-story distance to street level in a single vertical plunge that should have created a crater, but instead produced only a sound like a hammer striking an anvil forged in the heart of a dying star. The shockwave rolled outward, shattering windows in a perfect expanding circle. Car alarms screamed. People ran, and the armored figure simply stood in the center of the impact site, utterly still, its helmeted head tilting upward as if searching for something specific in the chaos it had just created. Tarlow's camera clicked 3 times before his conscious mind registered the motion. Training. Instinct. The mechanical eye capturing what his human eye struggled to fully process. Then Superman arrived. The Man of Steel came from the east, a blue and red streak that resolved into perfect human form as he decelerated to a hover 50 feet above the street. His cape billowed in wind currents that didn't exist at ground level. His expression held the carefully calibrated concern that Tarlow had photographed 100 times before, the face of someone simultaneously assessing threat levels, calculating civilian casualties, and preparing to solve the problem with minimal collateral damage. It was the face of controlled power, of strength deliberately restrained. The armored figure did not look up. Superman descended slowly, his hands open, palms forward, the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Tarlow zoomed in, capturing the moment frame by frame, building the narrative sequence that would accompany his dispatch. The hero's mouth moved, words Tarlow couldn't hear from his distant vantage point, but could easily imagine. Some variation of, "I don't want to fight you," or "Let's talk about this," or "There's always another way." The armored figure's response was immediate and comprehensive. It moved with a speed that turned motion into abstraction, crossing the 50-foot distance in a time interval too brief to constitute movement in any conventional sense. One moment it stood on broken asphalt. The next moment, its fist connected with Superman's jaw with an impact that produced a visible shockwave, an expanding hemisphere of compressed air that flattened everything within a 30-foot radius. Superman shot backward like a meteor in reverse, his trajectory carving a horizontal line through 3 buildings before his body crashed into the Metropolis Bay with enough force to create a tsunami that would require immediate intervention to prevent harbor-wide devastation. Tarlo's camera captured the spray, the collapsing masonry, the armored figure standing absolutely motionless in the center of destruction, its head turned slightly, tracking Superman's flight path with what might have been calculation, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been nothing at all. The journalist's hands trembled as he changed lenses, switching to the longer focal length that would let him capture whatever happened next. His mind raced through possibilities, through frameworks of understanding that might contain what he'd just witnessed. Enhanced armor, Kryptonian technology, magic, some new threat that had emerged from whatever dimensional wound still pulsed and writhed in the sky above. But none of those frameworks adequately explained the sensation he'd felt in his bones when that punch connected, a wrongness that transcended mere violence, as if the laws governing force and motion and consequence had been temporarily suspended to accommodate something that operated according to different rules entirely. Superman erupted from the bay in a column of water and rage. His eyes blazed red, heat vision lancing toward the armored figure in twin beams of concentrated stellar fire. The kind of heat that could melt through reinforced concrete, that could cut aircraft carriers in half, that represented power measured in megatons. The armored figure stepped into the beams, not away, into them. The heat vision struck center mass, and for a moment the world turned white with thermal radiation. Tarlo threw up his arm to shield his eyes, his camera's auto-exposure screaming as it struggled to compensate. When his vision cleared, the armored figure stood unchanged, its chest plate glowing dull red but otherwise unmarked, and in its hands it held a weapon that definitely had not been there a moment before. The weapon defied easy classification. Part shotgun, part something older and more primal, its barrel array suggesting functionality that transcended mere ballistics. Tarlo's lens caught the details, symbols etched along the receiver that hurt to look at directly, a feed mechanism that seemed to draw ammunition from somewhere other than conventional space, and along the barrel's length, a patina that could have been rust or could have been something that had once been rust but had been transformed through exposure to temperatures and pressures that existed only in cosmic furnaces. The armored figure aimed and fired in a single fluid motion. Superman twisted, his superhuman reflexes allowing him to almost dodge, but the discharge caught his shoulder, and the Man of Steel screamed. Tarlo had never heard Superman scream before, had never imagined it was possible, but the sound that tore from the hero's throat was unmistakably pain, raw and visceral and wrong, and the wound that blossomed across Superman's invulnerable skin actually bled, crimson against blue fabric, impossible and undeniable. The fight became a storm. Superman's fist found the armored figure's helmet in a strike that should have decapitated, but the figure merely staggered, absorbed the impact through some internal mechanism, and retaliated with an upward blow that lifted the hero 30 feet into the air. Superman recovered mid-flight, came back down with both fists raised above his head, hammer strike descending with enough force to create a secondary crater. The armored figure crossed both arms above its head, caught the blow on its braces, and the resulting shockwave shattered every window within 6 blocks. They traded blows with a speed that turned them into blurs of motion punctuated by impact, sounds like artillery fire. Each exchange created destruction. Parked cars crumpled, streetlights bent. The pavement itself began to fracture in a web of cracks that spread outward from their conflict's epicenter. Tarlo photographed it all, his journalist's instinct overriding his survival instinct, capturing the images that would either make his career or serve as his obituary. He documented the moment Superman grabbed the armored figure by the shoulders and simply flew upward, carrying his opponent into the stratosphere where collateral damage became irrelevant. He captured the green contrails they left behind, the way the rupture in the sky seemed to pulse in rhythm with their ascent, as if whatever had created that wound was paying attention to the violence unfolding in its shadow. They disappeared beyond cloud cover. Tarlo waited, his camera aimed at empty sky, counting heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. The clouds ignited, not metaphorically, literally ignited, water vapor and nitrogen and oxygen undergoing some impossible reaction that turned the entire cloud layer into a brief, brilliant inferno that painted the sky the color of molten copper. Somewhere in that fire, Superman and the armored stranger were still fighting, their conflict escalating beyond the constraints of Earth's atmosphere, beyond the limitations of normal physics. When they returned, they were moving at escape velocity. The armored figure held Superman in what could only be described as a grapple, both hands locked around the hero's neck, and they fell together like a comet wreathed in flames that peeled away from their bodies in ribbons of superheated plasma. The angle of descent suggested impact point somewhere in the industrial district, and Tarlo found himself running, his camera forgotten around his neck, his legs carrying him toward the collision site with the same compulsion that had driven him into war zones, the absolute need to witness, to document, to serve as the eyes of humanity when confronting the incomprehensible. The impact occurred in an abandoned foundry, a relic of Metropolis's industrial past scheduled for demolition. The building received its demolition ahead of schedule, reduced to its constituent atoms by the kinetic energy of two near-indestructible bodies falling from space. The explosion created a mushroom cloud visible from orbit, a pillar of fire and debris that climbed 3,000 feet into the air before gravity reasserted itself and brought it all crashing down. Tarlo arrived as the debris was still falling, ash and pulverized concrete creating an apocalyptic snowfall that turned afternoon into twilight. His camera rose automatically, capturing the scene through the gray precipitation, and through his viewfinder he saw movement in the crater. Both figures still fought. Superman's costume was torn, his cape reduced to tatters, blood streaming from a dozen wounds that should not exist on invulnerable skin. But his eyes still blazed with determination, with the absolute conviction that he could end this, could find the solution that would stop the violence without requiring him to kill. Because Superman did not kill, it was the foundational principle of his existence, the line he would not cross regardless of provocation. The armored figure seemed to understand this, seemed to recognize the restraint as tactical weakness. It pressed the attack with a methodical brutality that transformed the crater into an arena. Each exchange of blows reshaping the landscape, molten metal from the destroyed foundry splashing like water with each impact. Superman fought with increasing desperation, his strikes carrying enough force to shatter mountains, but somehow failing to put down an opponent who should have been rendered unconscious or dead by the first serious blow. Tarlo watched through his lens and began to understand, began to see the pattern beneath the chaos. Every time Superman landed a devastating strike, every time he seemed on the verge of overwhelming his opponent through sheer power, the armored figure adapted, moved differently, hit harder, as if the violence itself was feeding something inside that armor, as if danger and damage were somehow increasing its capability rather than diminishing it. The realization hit him like ice water. Superman couldn't win, not through force, not when the opponent's strength seemed to scale in direct proportion to the threat he faced. Every escalation from Superman would be met with equal escalation from the stranger, and the Man of Steel's reluctance to kill created an asymmetry that favored the one with no such compunctions. Superman realized it too. Tarlo saw it in the hero's eyes, the moment of recognition, the tactical assessment that concluded with acceptance of an unacceptable truth. The Man of Steel's next move wasn't an attack, it was containment. He grabbed the armored figure, wrapped his arms around its torso in an unbreakable bear hug, and flew straight up, accelerating hard, putting distance between the fight and the city below. They disappeared into the sky. Tarlo lowered his camera, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Around him, emergency services were beginning to arrive, fire trucks and ambulances and police cordons establishing perimeter. He should have been taking pictures of the aftermath, of the human cost, of the rescue workers pulling survivors from collapsed buildings, but instead he found his gaze drawn upward to the rupture still pulsing in the sky, and he noticed for the first time that it was changing. The green luminescence was darkening, taking on shades of red and amber, and through the rift he could see movement, shapes, writhing silhouettes that suggested morphology but refused to resolve into anything the human eye could fully process. And from the rift, a sound began to emerge. a low sub-frequency rumble that resonated in bone rather than ear, that carried within it the suggestion of vast spaces and infinite hunger. Something was trying to come through. Whatever was emerging from the rift was ancient and patient, its essence leaking into the world in invisible currents that transformed the air itself, made it thick and difficult to breathe, tinged with a coppery sweetness that Tarlo recognized from battlefield photography as the scent that preceded mass death. The reporter's instincts screamed at him to run, to put distance between himself and whatever was clawing its way into reality through that dimensional wound. Instead, he raised his camera and began shooting. The sky above Metropolis was turning red. Superman and the armored stranger fell back to Earth somewhere over the Atlantic, their conflict visible from 3 continents as a ball of light and violence that skipped across the ocean's surface like a stone, each impact creating waterspouts that rose thousands of feet into the air. The Man of Steel was no longer holding back, no longer restraining his strength to avoid permanent damage. His heat vision burned at maximum intensity. His strikes carried enough force to split tectonic plates, and still the armored figure matched him blow for blow, its weapon now discarded in favor of bare-handed combat that seemed to operate according to principles that predated humanity's understanding of how violence worked. They crashed into the Azores with enough force to trigger seismographs in every observatory on the planet. The island chain shuddered under the impact, ancient volcanic rock fracturing as Superman drove his opponent down through solid stone, trying to bury him, to contain him, to stop the escalation before it consumed everything within a 1,000-mile radius. The armored figure exploded upward through a quarter-mile of rock and emerged standing on Superman's chest, its fist raised and descending, and Superman caught that fist one-handed, his entire body straining against the force, his other hand coming up to push against the stranger's helmet, red light gathering behind his eyes for a point-blank discharge that would either end the fight or blind him permanently. Neither happened. The armored figure's helmet turned slightly, angling its visor directly into Superman's heat vision, and when the beams struck, something inside that helmet reflected them back, doubled, tripled, transformed into something that carried not just heat but entropy itself, and Superman gasped as the reflected energy burned him, impossibly burned Kryptonian skin that had survived the heart of stars. The Man of Steel's grip faltered, the armored figure's fist descended. The impact drove Superman into the volcanic bedrock with enough force to create a new crater that would later be studied by geologists as evidence of meteorite strike or divine intervention, depending on which academic discipline one preferred. The hero lay motionless, his chest still rising and falling but his eyes closed, his body pushed beyond even Kryptonian endurance by an opponent who seemed to have no upper limit, no threshold beyond which further escalation became impossible. The armored figure stood over him, utterly still, and for a long moment nothing moved except the smoke rising from both of their bodies. Then it reached down, not to strike again, but to grip Superman's shoulder, and lifted the unconscious hero with surprising gentleness, cradling him almost carefully as it rose into the air. Not through flight, as Superman flew, with grace and control, but through some other mechanism that simply negated gravity's claim, made vertical distance irrelevant, through force of will or technology, or something that blurred the line between the two. They returned to Metropolis to find the city transforming. The rupture had grown. What had been a 200-foot tear was now half a mile wide, and from it emerged not shapes but presences, entities that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process, so what the eye reported was inherently incomplete, like trying to see a sphere by examining its two-dimensional shadow. Where these presences touched the city, corruption spread. Buildings didn't collapse so much as they forgot how to be buildings, their structural integrity dissolving not through physical damage, but through conceptual decay, as if the very idea of architecture was being erased from local reality. People fled in waves of panic that rolled through the streets like tsunami surge. Emergency broadcasts blared from every speaker. The sky bled colors that had no names in human language, and above it all, the rupture pulsed like a wound that refused to heal. each pulse sending fresh waves of wrongness cascading through the urban landscape. Ron Tarlow stood on his rooftop position and photographed it all, his camera clicking mechanically, building the visual record that might be all that survived if this escalation continued unchecked. Through his lens, he watched the armored figure descend to street level, still carrying Superman, watched it lay the hero down with something approaching reverence, watched it straighten and turn its helmeted gaze upward toward the rupture. For the first time since its arrival, the figure spoke. Tarlow didn't hear words so much as he felt them. Vibrations that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his skull, carrying meaning that transcended language. Hell. The single syllable hung in the air like an indictment. Superman stirred, groaning as consciousness returned, his healing factor already working to repair the damage despite the impossible nature of his injuries. His eyes opened, focused on the armored figure standing over him, and Tarlow saw the moment when the hero made his decision. Superman's hand shot out, not to attack but to restrain, his fingers closing around the stranger's ankle in a grip that could have crushed titanium. "Wait," Superman said, his voice hoarse but still carrying that fundamental decency that defined him. "We can fix this together." The armored figure looked down at him. The visor was opaque, revealing nothing of whatever face or intelligence existed behind it, but somehow Tarlow felt the weight of ancient eyes turning to regard the hero, measuring him, assessing him, finding him wanting in some fundamental way. "You don't understand," Superman continued, pushing himself upright despite obvious pain. "Whatever that is, whatever's coming through, we can stop it without more violence. There's always another way. We just have to." The armored figure's hand moved faster than Superman could react, not to strike, but to press something against the hero's chest, a device that hummed with energy that made Tarlow's teeth ache even from his distant vantage point. Superman convulsed, his back arching, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the device did something to him, something that read his fundamental nature and recoiled from what it found. When the device deactivated, Superman collapsed, gasping, and the armored figure stepped away, its helmeted head tilting as if it had confirmed a hypothesis. Tarlow's camera captured the moment, the way Superman's expression shifted from pain to confusion to dawning horror. "No," the hero whispered. "That's not possible." But the device had revealed truth, had peeled back the layers of reality and shown Superman what the armored figure already knew, what had brought it through the rupture in pursuit of something that could not be allowed to exist. The Phantom Zone had been corrupted, not recently. Not through any action Superman could have prevented or predicted, but fundamentally, at its core, the zone itself had been transformed into something else. Something that resonated with frequencies that only one force in all the multiverse could produce. The Phantom Zone had become Hell's backdoor into Superman's universe. And Superman himself, through years of exposure, through countless battles where zone energy had bled into reality whenever he'd used the projector, had been marked, tagged, identified as a potential host for something that waited in the spaces between dimensions, patient and hungry and utterly inhuman. The corruption wasn't complete. Not yet. Superman's essential goodness, his fundamental decency, created resistance that slowed the process. But it was happening nonetheless, molecule by molecule, cell by cell, the Man of Steel being transformed into something that would serve as Hell's champion in this pristine universe, a being of unlimited power twisted to serve unlimited malice. Tarlow watched Superman's face cycle through denial, rage, and finally a terrible understanding. Watched the hero look up at the armored figure and ask the question that would define everything that followed. Can it be stopped? The armored figure was silent for a long moment. Then it reached up and unsealed its helmet, servos hissing as ancient mechanisms disengaged, and removed the faceplate to reveal features that could have been human once, 1,000,000 years ago, before rage and purpose had burned away everything except the absolute commitment to a war that had no end. When it spoke, its voice was ruined, stone grinding against itself. Yes, one word, but the meaning beneath that word was comprehensive and unambiguous. It could be stopped, but the price would be Superman's life, the permanent removal of the potential host before the corruption could complete its transformation, before hell could gain a foothold in a universe that still contained hope and light and the possibility that good could triumph over entropy. Superman stood, his legs trembling but his spine straight, his cape torn and bloody but still moving in wind currents that suggested defiance. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," the armored figure said, its ruined voice carrying absolute certainty. "Mercy is corruption's greatest weapon, compassion its most effective tool. You think your goodness protects you. It damns you. It creates the opening through which darkness enters, disguised as necessity, as the greater good, as the hard choice that serves the many. I have witnessed 1,000 worlds fall because their champions believed as you believe, that there is always another option, that violence is the last resort, rather than the only response to evil that wears infinite faces." Superman's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not giving up. Not on myself. Not on the people of this city. And not on you, whoever you are, because I've seen what you can do, and if you really were beyond redemption, you wouldn't have caught me when I fell. You wouldn't have laid me down gently instead of finishing what you started." The armored figure's expression remained unchanged, carved from stone that had witnessed eons of bloodshed. "I did not spare you from mercy. I spared you because you are not yet the enemy, but you will be. The corruption progresses even now. I can see it bleeding through your aura, taste it in the air around you. In hours or days or weeks, you will become what hell intends, and when that moment arrives, this universe will scream as you tear it apart from within, convinced until the final moment that you are saving it." Above them, the rupture pulsed, and something massive began to push through, a limb or appendage or concept of limb that defied optical processing, its surface crawling with geometries that hurt to perceive. The air temperature spiked 40 degrees in seconds. Car alarms screamed in harmony. Windows that had somehow survived the earlier violence now shattered in sympathy with whatever frequency that emerging thing broadcast. Superman looked up at it, then back at the armored figure. "Then help me fight it. Help me protect these people. Afterwards, we can figure out the rest. But right now, right here, we're on the same side whether you want to admit it or not." For a long moment, the armored figure said nothing. Then it replaced its helmet, the servos sealing with a finality that suggested decisions made and locked into place. When it spoke again, its voice came through whatever communication system that armor contained, transformed into something flat and without inflection. "You do not understand what you are offering alliance with. I am not a hero. I am a weapon forged in hell's own fires, tempered in the blood of demons and angels alike, existing only to deliver judgment against corruption in all its forms. I have destroyed worlds, I have killed gods, I have burned away civilizations because they were infected with darkness and thought themselves strong enough to contain it. If you stand beside me, you accept that what follows will be absolute. No mercy for the corrupted, no exceptions for the afflicted, no room for the compassion that you believe defines you." Superman met that opaque visor without flinching. "Then I'll keep you from going too far. And you'll keep me from becoming what you say is inevitable. That's what allies do. They balance each other." The armored figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture that might have been amusement or might have been something else entirely. Then it reached behind its back and drew a weapon that had not been there before, a blade forged from metal that seemed to reject light rather than reflect it, its edge so fine that it appeared to cut space itself merely by existing. "The crucible," it said, and even through the helmet's distortion, Tarlo heard reverence in that voice. "Forged in the sanctum of the seraphim, quenched in the blood of the Titan, blessed and cursed and made holy through purpose. Touch it." Superman hesitated, his super senses clearly detecting something about that blade that made him wary, but he reached out and gripped the handle below the armored figure's hand. The moment his skin made contact, energy erupted along the blade's length, not red or green or any normal color but something else, something that existed in the spectrum between divine and demonic, and Superman gasped as information flooded into him. Through the blade, through whatever connection it created, the man of steel saw. He saw wars that had raged across dimensions, campaigns that measured their casualties not in millions but in worlds, conflicts where the stakes were nothing less than the fundamental nature of reality itself. He saw the figures past, its origin, its purpose, witnessed the moment when a human once named something that no longer mattered had been transformed into an eternal engine of wrath, granted power beyond comprehension, and aimed at hell like a bullet fired from God's own weapon. He saw the Slayer's crusade, an endless march through infernal dimensions, killing demons not as warfare but as absolute law, as the fundamental principle that corruption must be answered with annihilation, that mercy granted to evil was itself a form of evil, that the only response to hell's infinite hunger was infinite rage, matched with infinite purpose. And he saw what the Slayer had become in pursuit of that crusade. The pieces of humanity that had been burned away in fires that never stopped burning, the isolation that came from being the only warrior capable of fighting on hell's own ground, the loneliness of being a weapon that could never be sheathed because the war would never end, could never end because hell itself was eternal and would always find new cracks through which to seep into reality. Superman's hand released the blade as if burned, and he staggered back, his eyes wide with understanding that bordered on horror. "You're killing yourself," he said quietly. "This war you're fighting, it's destroying you piece by piece." The Slayer returned the crucible to wherever it resided when not in use. "I was destroyed long ago. What remains is purpose. What remains is necessary." "No," Superman said, shaking his head. "There's still someone in there. I felt it through the blade. You're not just a weapon. You're still a person who remembers what it was like to hope, to believe things could get better. You've just buried it so deep that you've forgotten it exists. Hope is a luxury purchased with other people's suffering," the Slayer replied. "I cannot afford it." Whatever response Superman might have made was cut off by a sound that seemed to originate from every direction at once, a choir of voices that were not quite voices singing hymns that were not quite music, and from the rupture above them descended something that wore divinity like a poorly fitted costume, its form approximating an angel in the same way that a praying mantis approximates prayer. It stood 20 feet tall, its wings stretching 60 feet from tip to tip, each feather a sword, each sword inscribed with names that blazed with light that was somehow darker than shadow. Its face held too many eyes, all of them weeping blood that ran upward instead of down, and when it spoke, the words came from everywhere except its mouth. "Children of clay and crystal, your resistance has been witnessed and judged insufficient. The Phantom Zone has served its purpose, drawing Superman into proximity with dimensional energies that prepared his essence for transcendence. He will become the herald. He will open the gates willingly. He will believe himself a savior even as he births damnation." Superman launched himself at the entity without hesitation, his fist cocked back to deliver a blow that could shatter planets, but the angel thing simply raised one hand and the hero stopped mid-flight, frozen in mid-air, as if time itself had paused around him. The Slayer moved in the same instant, covering ground with that impossible speed that turned distance into suggestion. The crucible appearing in its hand already swinging, its blade aimed at the joint where the entity's wing met its torso. The entity caught the blade between two fingers and smiled with a mouth that opened sideways. "The Doomslayer," it said, and its voice held recognition tinged with something that might have been respect or might have been anticipation. "The Sentinel, the scourge of hell, your legend has crossed dimensional barriers, reached even unto the throne rooms of the Maker, but this universe operates according to different laws. Here, divinity and demonology are not opposites but spectrum, and you cannot kill what exists as both simultaneously." The Slayer's response was to activate some mechanism in his armor, and his entire body became wreathed in energy that Tarlo recognized from the initial rupture, the same sick green luminescence that had torn reality open above Metropolis. Where that energy touched the angel thing, its flesh began to smoke and blacken, divine matter reacting poorly to contact with whatever force the Slayer channeled. The entity released the crucible and backed away, its smile fading into something like concern. "Argent energy," it said. refined hell essence weaponized against itself. Clever, effective, but ultimately inadequate. You face not demons here, Slayer, but something older, something that existed before hell learned to crawl, before heaven learned to fly. You face the architects, the beings who designed the cosmic machinery that required hell as its exhaust system and heaven as its pretension toward function. The Slayer said nothing, but his armor's energy output increased, the green luminescence brightening until it hurt to look at directly, and he charged, the crucible swinging in arcs that left after images burned into the air itself. The angel thing moved to evade, its wings creating hurricane winds that toppled buildings for 6 blocks in every direction, and their battle became a storm of light and violence that exceeded what any recording equipment could capture. Superman, still frozen, could only watch as the Slayer and the entity tore into each other with a fury that suggested ancient grudges playing out through new proxies. Blood fell upward, feathers rained down that burst into flame before touching ground. The angel thing's voice never stopped speaking, continuing its sermon even as it fought. Superman's corruption serves a higher purpose. Through him, we will remake this universe according to templates older than your crusade, Slayer. Your rage is impressive, your resilience beyond remarkable, but rage without understanding is merely noise, and understanding requires accepting that sometimes evil serves evolution, that suffering is the friction that produces progress. The Slayer's fist connected with the entity's face, and the impact produced a sound like a bell cast from bone being struck with a hammer forged from war itself. The angel thing's head snapped back, several of its eyes rupturing, and for a moment it seemed surprised that something could hurt it, that this armored intruder from a foreign dimension could damage divine flesh. The Slayer did not pause to savor the moment. It grabbed the entity by what might have been its throat and activated another mechanism in its armor. And this time what emerged was not energy but sound, a frequency so low it existed below human hearing, but its effects were immediately visible as matter began to vibrate itself apart in response to the resonance. The angel thing screamed, its voice losing all pretense of divinity, becoming raw and animal, and it clawed at the Slayer's arm, its sword feathers slashing at armor that refused to yield, that had survived attacks from beings that made this pretender seem juvenile in comparison. They fell together, crashing through the street into the sewers below, then through bedrock, descending into the earth itself, as their battle continued beyond sight. Above ground, whatever had frozen Superman released him, and the hero fell the dozen feet to the broken street, landing in a crouch, his eyes scanning for the combatants. Tarlo watched from his distant position as Superman's super hearing tracked the conflict beneath the surface, watched the hero's expression cycle through calculation and decision. Then Superman flew straight up, not down toward the fighting, but up toward the rupture, and Tarlo understood the logic even as his heart sank. If the Slayer was right, if Superman's continued existence meant eventual transformation into Hell's champion, then the hero was choosing to remove himself from the equation the only way he could, by sealing himself into the Phantom Zone, by accepting imprisonment in the very place that had infected him, rather than risk becoming the threat the Slayer had described. It was the most Superman decision imaginable, self-sacrifice as the ultimate expression of heroism, and Tarlo wanted to scream that there had to be another way, that giving up wasn't the solution, but his voice caught in his throat because he'd seen the truth through his lens, had witnessed the way darkness bled through Superman's aura like ink through water, and he knew with journalist certainty that the hero was already losing the battle against corruption that occurred at a molecular level. Superman reached the rupture and plunged inside without hesitation. The rupture convulsed. What had been a stable tear in reality became a thrashing wound, its edges expanding and contracting rapidly, as if whatever dimensional machinery maintained its existence had suddenly been subjected to interference it could not process. Energy lashed outward in random directions, green and red, and colors that had no place in normal space, each discharge leaving scars in the air itself, zones where causality seemed to operate backward or not at all. From the rupture, Superman's voice echoed, distorted and multiplied until it sounded like a chorus. "Close it. Whatever you have to do, seal this thing before." His words cut off mid-sentence. replaced by a sound that Tarlo would later struggle to describe in his dispatch, a wet tearing noise that suggested organic matter undergoing transformation. It was never meant to survive, accompanied by Superman's scream, the first time Tarlo had heard the hero's voice carry not pain but horror, the absolute terror of someone witnessing their own corruption and being powerless to prevent it. The ground beneath Metropolis erupted as the Slayer emerged, still grappling with the angel thing, both of them damaged now, the entity missing one wing and several eyes, while the Slayer's armor had been breached in multiple places, revealing glimpses of the flesh beneath, scarred and burned and somehow still functional despite injuries that should have been terminal. The Slayer looked up at the rupture, at the way it pulsed and convulsed, and something in its posture changed. Tarlo, watching through his lens from a mile away, saw the moment when the Slayer understood what Superman had done, saw the warrior's helmeted head tilt in what might have been respect, or might have been fury, that the hero had chosen self-sacrifice over accepting the necessary violence. The angel thing used the Slayer's distraction to break free, its remaining wing beating once to create distance, blood and divine matter dripping from wounds that refused to heal. Too late, it rasped, its voice now broken and raw. The transformation accelerates, Superman's essence, his fundamental goodness. It resists, but that resistance only makes the corruption stronger when it finally claims him completely. He will emerge as herald, as the dark messiah who proves that even the purest light can be twisted into shadow, and this universe will fall not through invasion but through revelation, through the understanding that hope itself is the cruelest lie ever told. The Slayer's response was immediate and comprehensive. It drew a weapon that Tarlo had not seen before, something that looked like a rifle designed by beings who understood that warfare extended beyond 3 dimensions, and fired a single shot directly into the rupture. The projectile, if it could be called that, seemed to expand as it flew, growing from bullet size to artillery shell to something larger, its surface rippling with inscriptions that glowed with the same green luminescence the Slayer's armor channeled. When it entered the rupture, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The tear in reality began to seal, not gradually but rapidly, its edges pulling together like a wound responding to cauterization. And from within came Superman's voice again, clearer now, the words carrying terrible urgency. "No, don't seal it. I'm still in here. If you close it while I'm—" The Slayer fired again, and again. Each shot accelerated the sealing process, the rupture shrinking despite whatever it contained, trying desperately to keep it open. Superman's voice became fainter, his words lost beneath the sound of dimensional boundaries reasserting themselves, and Tarlo realized with dawning horror that the Slayer was willingly trapping Superman in the Phantom Zone, was choosing containment over rescue, because rescue meant unleashing whatever the hero was becoming. "Stop!" Tarlo heard himself screaming, his voice lost in the chaos but his throat raw from the effort. "You're killing him. Superman is still in there." The Slayer did not stop. The rupture sealed completely with a sound like reality itself sighing in relief, and where there had been a half-mile wound in the sky there was now only unmarked blue, as if the entire incident had been hallucination or mass delusion. Except the city was in ruins, buildings collapsed or corrupted, streets torn open, fires raging in a dozen districts, and lying in the crater where the foundry had stood, the angel thing's body twitched and leaked divine ichor that ate through concrete like acid. The Slayer walked to the entity, the crucible appearing in its hand, and drove the blade through what might have been the thing's heart. The angel thing's eyes, the ones that remained, fixed on the Slayer's visor. "You have saved nothing," it whispered, delayed perhaps, but corruption is patient. It will find another way, another host, another universe. The machinery requires it, the mathematics demand it. Evil is not a bug in creation's code but a feature, and you cannot debug existence itself. The crucible ignited, flames running along its length, and the angel thing's body immolated from within, burning with fire that left no ash, that consumed matter and converted it directly to absence. In seconds, nothing remained except scorched ground and the smell of ozone mixed with something sweeter and more terrible. The Slayer stood alone in the crater, its armor still bleeding that sick green energy, its posture suggesting exhaustion despite the inhuman endurance it had displayed. Slowly, it turned, its helmet scanning the devastation surrounding it, measuring the cost in a calculus that only it understood. Tarlo photographed it all, his camera clicking automatically, building the record that would define how this day was remembered. He captured the Slayer's silhouette against the burning city. He captured the empty sky where the rupture had been. He captured the destroyed buildings and the emergency vehicles converging on impact sites, and the people beginning to emerge from shelters, their faces showing the particular expression that comes from surviving something that should have killed everyone within 100 miles. Then the Slayer looked directly at him. Tarlo had been careful, had maintained his distance, had stayed behind cover, and used telephoto lenses to capture images from positions that should have been undetectable. But the Slayer's helmet turned, oriented on his exact location with precision that suggested it had been aware of him the entire time, had allowed him to photograph the violence because it understood that what happened here needed to be witnessed, needed to enter the public record. The journalist's finger froze on the shutter button. The Slayer raised one hand, palm forward, and for a terrible moment Tarlo thought he was about to die, that the warrior would eliminate the witness to prevent whatever narrative the footage might create. But the gesture was not threatening. It was acknowledgement, permission, the understanding that passed between photographer and subject, that what had been captured would be shared, would be studied, would become part of history. Then the Slayer simply disappeared, not vanishing in a flash of light or teleportation effect, but simply ceasing to exist in that location, as if it had decided it was done with this place and therefore was no longer here, the universe accommodating its will through mechanisms that transcended technology or magic. Tarlo lowered his camera with trembling hands. The city burned around him. Emergency sirens wailed. People screamed. The sky was blue and innocent, hiding the cosmic horror that had almost torn through reality itself. And somewhere in the Phantom Zone, Superman was trapped, fighting his own transformation, isolated from the help he desperately needed because the alternative was worse than imprisonment. The journalist sat down on the rooftop edge, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight, and began reviewing the images in his camera's memory, building the story that would accompany his dispatch. The photos were remarkable, each one a perfectly composed moment of apocalyptic violence. But as he scrolled through them, he noticed something that his conscious mind had missed while shooting. In every single image that included both Superman and the Slayer, regardless of the action occurring, regardless of the destruction or violence, there was a moment where the Slayer's posture suggested restraint. A fist pulled at the last instant, a weapon angled away from vital areas, a grapple that immobilized rather than crippled. The warrior had been fighting with lethal efficiency against the angel thing, had shown no mercy to an entity it deemed enemy, but against Superman, against the hero it had claimed was becoming corrupted and needed to be killed, the Slayer had never once gone for a fatal strike. It had beaten Superman unconscious. It had damaged him. It had pushed the hero to his absolute limits. But it had never tried to kill him, which meant somewhere beneath the rage and purpose and inhuman determination, the Slayer had believed Superman could be saved, had been testing him, pushing him toward choices that might break the corruption's hold. The imprisonment in the Phantom Zone had not been execution but quarantine, a way to buy time while the infection that existed at a molecular level could be studied and possibly reversed. Or Tarlo was reading hope into actions that carried none, projecting humanity onto something that had transcended human limitations so completely that it no longer operated according to recognizable moral frameworks. He would never know for certain. What he did know was that Superman was gone, potentially forever, and Metropolis had learned that there were threats beyond even their hero's capacity to handle, forces that viewed good and evil not as opposing principles, but as tools to be used in conflicts that predated human civilization by epochs measured in cosmic rather than terrestrial time. Tarlo began typing his dispatch, his fingers moving across his phone's keyboard automatically, building sentences that would carry this day's events into the public consciousness. He wrote about Superman's sacrifice, about the armored stranger who had fought with terrifying efficiency, about the entity that had claimed to be older than the moral frameworks humanity took for granted. about the rupture that had sealed but might open again, because corruption was patient and would always seek new ways to spread. He did not write about the hope he'd glimpsed in the Slayer's restraint, because hope required evidence, and all he had were photographs and interpretation, and journalism demanded more certainty than that. But he kept those images anyway, stored them in a separate file marked for personal reference, because someday he might understand what he'd witnessed, might piece together the full narrative from fragments captured through a camera lens. The sun was setting by the time rescue operations reached full deployment, the sky turning red and gold in ways that seemed almost mockingly beautiful after the day's horrors. Tarlo descended from the rooftop, his camera heavy around his neck, his body aching with exhaustion that went beyond physical. He had witnessed war. He had photographed atrocity, but nothing had prepared him for the moment when he'd watched two titans of different universes collide with force enough to reshape continents, driven by philosophies that could not be reconciled without one of them being destroyed. Superman had chosen destruction of self over destruction of principle, had accepted imprisonment over compromising his belief that there was always another way. It was heroic in the purest sense, and Tarlo knew that historians would debate for generations whether it had been wisdom or fatal idealism that had driven the choice. The Slayer had chosen certainty over mercy, had acted according to doctrine that allowed no exceptions, no room for compassion that might provide corruption with opportunity. It was efficient in the coldest sense, and Tarlo knew that philosophers would debate for generations whether it represented necessity or the surrender of humanity in pursuit of victory. Neither choice was wrong. Neither choice was right. They simply existed as the only options available to beings operating at the extreme edge of what was possible, where every decision carried consequences measured in worlds rather than lives. Tarlo filed his dispatch from a temporary press center established 6 blocks from the impact site. His editor called within minutes, her voice sharp with urgency. "These photos are incredible. We're running the story on every platform. But Ron, I need you to confirm one detail. This armored figure, this Slayer, your dispatch calls him a warrior from another dimension. Do we have any proof of that? Any confirmation beyond your interpretation?" Tarlo thought about the device the Slayer had pressed against Superman's chest, about the way it had read the hero's fundamental nature and recoiled. He thought about the crucible, about the energies it had channeled that didn't correspond to any known science. He thought about the way the Slayer had simply ceased to exist, vanishing not through technology but through will. "The proof is in what he did," Tarlo said finally. "He sealed a dimensional rupture using weapons and techniques that don't exist in any database. He fought an entity that claimed to be older than heaven and hell, and he imprisoned Superman rather than kill him, which means he had options we don't, capabilities that suggest he's dealt with corruption on this scale before. Where else could he be from, except somewhere that required him to become what he is?" His editor was silent for a moment, then, "Okay, I trust your judgment. The story goes live in 20 minutes. Be ready for the response. This is going to change everything." She had no idea how right she was. The story broke across the world like a second shockwave, Tarlo's photographs spreading through every news outlet, every social media platform, every forum where people gathered to make sense of chaos. The images of Superman and the Slayer locked in combat became instant iconography, symbols of conflicts that transcended normal understanding. The shot of the angel thing descending from the rupture gave theologians and scientists equal nightmares. And the final image, the Slayer standing alone in the crater with the burning city behind him, became a Rorschach test onto which people projected their own interpretations of what heroism meant when faced with threats that operated beyond conventional morality. Some called the Slayer a savior who had done what needed to be done. Others called him a monster who had imprisoned the only hero capable of inspiring hope. Some claimed Superman had been corrupted and the imprisonment was justified. Others insisted the hero would never fall and the Slayer had acted out of paranoia. The debates raged in every language, across every time zone, as humanity struggled to process the reality that their greatest champion was gone and the one who'd taken him was something they couldn't categorize. 3 days after the incident, with Metropolis still digging itself out from under the rubble and the world still arguing about what had happened and why, Tarlo received a package at his apartment. No return address, no postage, no explanation for how it had bypassed building security and been left directly at his door. Inside was a data chip. Tarlo hesitated before plugging it into his computer, aware that it could contain anything from classified information to targeted malware, but journalists' curiosity overrode journalists' caution. The chip contained a single video file, no metadata, no identifying markers. When he played it, he saw Superman. The hero sat in what looked like empty space, though occasional ripples in the air around him suggested the Phantom Zone's unique physics were still active. His costume was torn but cleaned, his cape absent entirely. His face showed exhaustion that went beyond physical, the weight of someone fighting a battle that existed at every level simultaneously. "Ron Tarlo," Superman said, and his voice carried the particular weariness of someone who'd spent days without sleep. "The Slayer left me a device. I don't know how he delivered it or how it generates the power to transmit through the zone's barriers, but it gives me one chance to send a message before its energy depletes. I'm choosing to send it to you because you were there. You photographed what happened without bias, without trying to make me into more than I was, or making the Slayer into less than he is." Superman paused, looking off camera at something invisible. "The corruption is fighting me. I can feel it trying to reshape my thoughts, trying to convince me that the zone's imprisonment is unjust, that I should break free and show the world what I've learned about divine machinery and cosmic purpose. But every time those thoughts surface, I remember the Slayer's face when he removed his helmet. The absolute certainty in his eyes. He's seen this happen before. He's watched heroes fall and become the very evil they swore to fight against, and he's killed them. Every single time, without hesitation, without hope that they could be saved." The hero's voice cracked slightly. "Except me. He could have killed me a dozen times during our fight, should have, according to the doctrine he operates under, but he didn't. He sealed me in here instead, bought time for someone smarter than either of us to maybe figure out how to purge corruption that exists at a molecular level. It's the first time in his crusade that he's shown mercy, and it terrifies me, Ron, because it means he saw something in me that made him break his own rules, and I don't know if that something is worth the risk he's taking." Superman stood, the movement revealing that he'd lost weight, that the fight against corruption was taking a physical toll. "If I transform, if the infection wins, you need to make sure everyone understands what happens next. I will believe I'm saving the world. I will be convinced that everything I'm doing serves the greater good. I will speak in words that sound like wisdom and truth, but it will all be corruption wearing my face, using my power, exploiting the trust people have in Superman to spread darkness disguised as light." The hero looked directly into the camera, and Tarlo saw tears on his face, the first time he'd ever witnessed Superman cry. "Tell them not to believe me. Tell them that if I emerge from the zone claiming to have won the battle against corruption, claiming to have found a better way, they need to run, and they need to pray that the Slayer is close enough to hear their prayers, because he's the only one with the strength to do what I won't be able to ask for but will desperately need. He's the only one who can stop me permanently." The video cut to black. Tarlo sat in his apartment, staring at the screen, Superman's final words echoing in the silence. The hero had recorded a confession that destroyed his own legend, had admitted that the Man of Steel could be broken, could be turned into a weapon against everything he'd sworn to protect, and he'd trusted a war photographer to carry that message, to serve as the witness who would sound the alarm if the worst occurred. The journalist backed up the file in 7 different locations, physical and digital, local and cloud-based, ensuring that if the transmission had been intercepted, if someone tried to suppress Superman's warning, enough copies would survive to reach the public. Then he began writing the article that would accompany the video's release, building the context that would help people understand what they were seeing without letting his own horror bleed through into the text. It was the hardest piece he'd ever written. The article went live 48 hours later, the video embedded in the text, Superman's face frozen at the moment where tears tracked down his cheeks. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Within hours, protests formed outside what remained of LexCorp, people demanding that Superman's warning be taken seriously, that resources be devoted to finding a cure. Within days, every scientist, mystic, and superhero with relevant expertise had converged on the problem of purging corruption that existed at a molecular level, and through it all, no one could find the Slayer. Tarlo received thousands of messages, some thanking him for sharing the truth, others accusing him of destroying hope, still others demanding he reveal how he'd obtained the video. He answered none of them. His role was to witness and report, not to become part of the story. And he'd already crossed too many boundaries by accepting Superman's message, by serving as the hero's chosen messenger rather than maintaining journalistic distance. But, late at night, when the messages stopped coming and the city's sirens finally quieted, Tarlo would review his photographs from that terrible day, studying the Slayer's posture, the way the warrior had moved with purpose that transcended mere violence. He searched for clues about where such a being might have gone, what universe might have spawned something that combined ultimate power with absolute conviction that mercy was weakness. He found no answers. 6 months passed. Metropolis rebuilt. The city had practice at recovering from apocalyptic incidents, had developed systems and procedures for restoring infrastructure after super battles leveled entire districts. The crater where the foundry had stood became a memorial site. Flowers and candles and handwritten notes piled high in recognition of Superman's sacrifice. Some of the notes begged the hero to break free, to ignore the Slayer's warnings and return to protect them. Others thanked him for staying imprisoned, for choosing humanity's safety over his own freedom. Tarlo visited the memorial once, camera in hand but unused, simply standing among the mourners who treated Superman's imprisonment as equivalent to death. He read some of the notes, saw the desperation and hope and anger written in hundreds of different hands, and understood that the city was fragmenting into factions based on what they believed had happened and what should happen next. Some people worshipped the Slayer as a necessary savior who'd acted when no one else could. Others condemned him as a tyrant who'd stolen their hero. The debates raged in city council meetings and philosophy classrooms and bar arguments, everyone trying to process trauma through ideology, through finding someone to blame or praise. The journalist took no side. He simply continued documenting the aftermath, capturing images of a city learning to exist without the hero who'd defined it. His work during this period won awards that he accepted with quiet dignity, knowing that every accolade was purchased with Superman's continued imprisonment, with the hero's willingness to sacrifice everything to prevent the greater horror. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, Tarlo received a second package. This one contained no data chip, no video, just a single photograph, printed on old-fashioned paper, the image slightly grainy in a way that suggested it had been captured on film rather than digital sensor. The photograph showed Superman standing in what appeared to be a desert, sand dunes visible in every direction, the sky overhead a particular shade of blue that Tarlo recognized as Earth's atmosphere rather than the zone's twisted physics. The hero wore civilian clothes, jeans and a plain white t-shirt, and his face showed none of the exhaustion from the video. He looked healthy, whole, free. On the back of the photograph, a single sentence written in handwriting that looked like it had been carved into the paper rather than written on it. The corruption has been purged. He is free. Do not publish this. Tarlo stared at the photograph for a long time, his mind racing through possibilities. The Slayer had found a way to cure Superman, or Superman had cured himself, or this was a test. A way to see if the journalist would compromise his principles by withholding information the public deserved to know, or it was a fake, an attempt to create hope where none existed, to manipulate through false evidence. The photographer in him analyzed the image with professional skepticism. The lighting was consistent. The shadows fell correctly. Superman's proportions matched references from thousands of previous photographs. Every technical indicator suggested authenticity. But technical indicators could be faked by anyone with sufficient skill and motivation. The journalist in him recognized that publishing the photograph would either restore hope or create chaos, depending on whether it was real. If Superman was truly free and cured, his absence from the public eye suggested he was choosing isolation. perhaps because the corruption had shown him something about himself or the world that couldn't be unseen. Publishing would violate that choice, would drag him back into visibility before he was ready. But if the photograph was fake, publishing would expose the deception, would prevent people from being manipulated by false hope. Tarlo made his decision. He did not publish the photograph. Instead, he added it to the file of personal images, the evidence he was collecting not for immediate distribution but for historical record, for the time when enough distance existed that truth could be evaluated without the distortion of immediate emotion. Someday, decades from now, someone would review his complete archive and make their own judgments about what had happened and why. Until then, he would continue witnessing, continue documenting, continue serving as the eyes that saw without immediately interpreting, because that was what journalists did when history moved too fast for understanding to keep pace with events. The photograph went into a safe deposit box, sealed behind triple verification, a secret kept because some truths needed time before they could be shared without causing more harm than enlightenment. Life continued. Metropolis adapted to Superman's absence the way organisms adapt to missing limbs, learning new patterns of movement, developing compensations for capabilities that no longer existed. Other heroes stepped forward to fill the void, some successfully, others disastrously. Crime rates fluctuated. Property values in the Memorial District collapsed. The city learned to exist in a new configuration, defined by absence rather than presence. And Ron Tarlo continued photographing it all, building the visual record that would let future generations understand what had been lost and what had been gained and what remained permanently uncertain. Sometimes, late at night, he would take out the photograph of Superman standing free in the desert and study the hero's expression, searching for clues about what the Man of Steel had learned during his imprisonment, what insights had been purchased through suffering that existed at a molecular level. The face in the photograph showed peace, the particular serenity of someone who'd fought an internal war and emerged victorious not by defeating the enemy but by understanding it, by integrating the darkness rather than destroying it. Or maybe Tarlo was projecting again, reading depth into an image that showed nothing except a man standing in a desert, the meaning supplied by the viewer rather than the subject. He would never know for certain. What he did know was that somewhere in the multiverse, the Slayer continued his crusade, moving from universe to universe, dimension to dimension, delivering judgment against corruption in all its forms. The warrior who'd shown mercy once, who'd chosen containment over execution because something in Superman's fundamental nature had made him believe the hero could be saved. Tarlo hoped the Slayer had been right. He hoped Superman was free, was healed, was learning to exist in a world that no longer trusted him the way it once had. He hoped the corruption had been truly purged rather than merely suppressed, waiting for a moment of weakness to resurface. But hope was not evidence. Hope was not certainty. Hope was what people clung to when they couldn't bear the weight of uncertainty, when the alternative was despair that paralyzed rather than motivated. So Tarlo did what he always did when confronted with questions that had no immediate answers. He raised his camera and continued documenting, continued witnessing, continued building the record that would outlive his confusion and serve as foundation for whatever understanding might eventually emerge from chaos. The city burned and rebuilt and burned again. Heroes rose and fell and rose again. And somewhere in the distance between dimensions, two warriors carried their respective burdens, Superman fighting to remain the symbol of hope he'd always represented, the Slayer fighting to ensure that hope never became the weapon through which evil claimed victory. Their paths would cross again. Tarlo was certain of that, the way journalists develop certainty about narrative arcs that haven't completed yet. Next time, perhaps they would fight on the same side. Perhaps they would teach each other the lessons they'd each learned through suffering. Perhaps Superman would show the Slayer that mercy could be strength rather than weakness. Perhaps the Slayer would show Superman that rage could be righteous rather than corruption. Or perhaps they would simply kill each other, finally resolving the philosophical conflict that had defined their first encounter, settling through violence what could not be settled through conversation. Tarlo didn't know which outcome he wanted. He didn't know which outcome would serve the greater good. He knew only that when that meeting occurred, he would be there with his camera, documenting the moment for a world that desperately needed to understand what happened when ultimate power confronted ultimate purpose, when the man who would not kill faced the man who would not stop killing. Until then, he had work to do. The journalist checked his equipment one final time as sunset painted Metropolis in shades of amber and gold, the light hitting the memorial's flowers at an angle that turned them into small flames, each petal burning with temporary beauty that would fade by morning. He composed the shot carefully, waiting for the exact moment when the sun's angle would transform mourning into something that approached transcendence, when grief would become art through nothing more complicated than patience and attention to detail. The shutter clicked. The moment was captured. The record grew by one more image, one more piece of evidence that would help future generations understand what had been lost and what had been preserved and what remained suspended between salvation and damnation, waiting for resolution that might never come. Tarlo lowered his camera and walked home through streets that had learned to exist without their guardian, through a city that had discovered it could survive even when hope wore armor instead of a cape, even when salvation looked like imprisonment and rescue looked like abandonment. The world continued turning. The war continued raging beyond mortal sight. And somewhere in the spaces between universes, a warrior in green armor paused in his eternal crusade, long enough to wonder if he'd made the right choice, if Superman truly had been purged of corruption, or if mercy had been exactly the weakness his doctrine warned against. The Slayer would never know for certain until the next meeting, until Superman's path and his own intersected again, until the question of whether hope could survive contact with absolute conviction was finally answered, not through philosophy, but through fists and fire, and the terrible clarity that came when moral certainty collided with moral complexity. That day would come. They both knew it. The universe knew it. And when it came, Ron Tarlo would be there, camera ready, finger on the shutter button, prepared to document the moment when two definitions of heroism either found synthesis or destroyed each other trying. Until then, the journalist had work to do, images to capture, truth to preserve against the erosion of time and the distortion of memory. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, his camera heavy around his neck, carrying the weight of every photograph he'd taken, every moment he'd witnessed, every truth he'd captured before it could disappear into the chaos that consumed certainty. The door closed behind him. The city's sirens sang their familiar song, and in the sky above Metropolis, unmarked and healed, the space where a rupture had once threatened to birth hell remained silent and still, holding its secrets behind barriers that would not break again unless something far worse than corruption learned to knock.